This is the Better Ottawa Municipal Panel. Today is Friday, October the 17th. My name is Neil Saravandamutu. I am joined by Joanne Chianello and John Willing. Hello to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, it is a morning. We record around lunchtime, but today we're recording at 8 o'clock in the morning. Just
Always
because we're
tricky because you never know what's going to come out Friday afternoon, but it's my fault because I got to leave town. So we'll see what
well, and you
happens.
never know how awake you're going to be either, right?
That's very true.
Listen, it's been a relatively quiet week at City Hall, although there was one major file that came forward, which is Tewin, and we're going to be talking a lot about that today. But before we do, I just want to comment on something that happened last night. So Thursday evening, I was at an event. Joanne, you were hosting a discussion with Catherine McKenna on the release of her new book, Run Like a Girl. It was a great event. I just wanted to say you did a great job moderating, and I hope some of our audience was there also.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I actually heard people come up and say, oh, I love the podcast. So that was great. Catherine and I are old friends. And I mentioned this at the start of our conversation. I was just sort of one of those so-called fireside chats. One day I would actually like to have a fireside
Right.
chat in front of
Yes.
a fire. That would be nice. But it's probably too warm there. It was in the Glebe, and it was to launch her book for the community. She had a lot of volunteers who helped her win. And she really did get elected in a very different way. Anyhow, that was actually the first time I ever interviewed her, right? Because, when I covered local politics and she was in politics, it was a conflict because we'd been friends for a long time. And you know how I love the rules. So it was actually really fun to chat with her. And MPP Catherine McKenney was there. Councillor Riley Brockington was there. Saw a lot of people that I knew, but also it was great to have a lot of people I did not know just come up to talk to me. It was very nice to hear about they missed my reporting, which always makes me feel good, but also guilty for leaving reporting. But a lot of people talked about the podcast. So that was really fun. And it's good to see you there, Neil.
Yeah.
John, you do not come. We're just going to, call you out there. No,
I was like preparing for the pod all night.
No.
I was like on my computer watching the Jays, preparing for the pod as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was amazing how many people came considering the Jays were on.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's right. But Joanne, I just want to pick up on one point you made, and John, you might have thoughts on this too. Is that you mentioned that McKenna essentially did politics differently, and that's, I think, referring to, in a sense, how she came into politics in the first case. And some people will remember that, and I know this because I live in the riding. Catherine McKenna was knocking on doors, sort of like 2 years in advance of the election, and this is just unheard of at the time, or at least certainly the first time I'd sort of seen something like that, and was able to defeat a very popular sitting MP, Paul Dewar.
He was a lovely man. He was great.
Lovely man, yeah. But and what's interesting is that we've seen this model taken up by people like Bruce Fanjoy.
He literally says that he modeled his campaign on Catherine's campaign. He started also 2 years ahead of time. And for Catherine, she said she literally went to like the moms of her friends. Like she had to, because of course it's a party system. It's not like running for City Hall. You got to have a nomination. In the end, she was acclaimed. She said the party kept waiting for a star candidate to show up. Usually a man who was a lawyer, but no one materialized. So they're like, okay, I guess you can run. But she just did it with like connections of people who were not usually in politics. And that was kind of the interesting part of it, that a bunch of people who are not the usuals of the political world and bubble decided to come in. So it was quite inspirational, actually.
It was. Okay, let's jump into the business at City Hall this week. So Tewin came back, and John, I'm going to get you to explain it, but maybe I can just set this up. So reminder to everyone that Tewin is this controversial land development project that is proposed for the southeast of Ottawa. So if you can think where Finley Creek is, sort of south of the airport, and just go east from there all the way out to the Highway 417. That's essentially where Tewin would be. Now, Councillor Kavanagh introduced a motion to remove these lands from the urban boundary of the official plan. So in other words, the urban boundary, of course, is where developers are allowed to build homes if you're inside the urban boundary. If you're outside the urban boundary, it remains as farmers' fields or whatever, that not permissible to build homes on. And so the proposal was to take this parcel of land out of the urban boundary. so not able to build homes. So John, could you just start us off with what was Councillor Kavanagh's rationale for this motion, and then maybe you can cut to the chase and tell us how the how the vote ended before we get into the discussion.
Yes, I'm going to lead listeners and viewers all the way through the vote and build it up slowly. But I mean, people who pay attention to the news know how this ended anyway.
Yeah.
But if you read Councillor Kavanaugh's motion, it's very long, right? So, Neil, you asked, what are the reasons why Councillor Kavanaugh brought this to the table? Well, there are many, many reasons, and they're in the motion, whether it be because she believes the city failed to consult Indigenous communities, more Algonquin communities, or if it's a financial reason, or if it's because it's a planning reason. It's all in her motion that she brought to the planning committee. But I think the issue that really took the fore was, like, on the front burner was, in her mind, the city's failure to consult Algonquin communities outside of the Algonquins of Ontario. And I think that's what took center stage for the most part at committee. And so what happened was a 7-5 vote against Councillor Kavanaugh's motion. And I'll say the voting record here, so it's on the record. So voting with Kavanaugh was Jeff Leeper, who's the chair of the committee, Riley Brockington, Lane Johnson, and Ariel Troster. And voting against the motion were Glenn Gower, David Brown, Kathy Curry, Laura Dudas, Clark Kelly, and Wilson Lowe. And so we'll see if this is where it ends. Maybe, maybe not. Joanne, what do you think?
Well, I've been asking around. When when a motion fails at a committee, it doesn't automatically rise to council. So if it gets approved, then council has to also approve it. But if it fails, it doesn't have to rise to council. However, a member of the committee, I don't actually think it has to be a member of the committee, but somebody can. No, I think it does. But can actually bring it to council for a vote there. I checked with Teresa Kavanaugh's office. She is not going to do that. But some other councillors are still talking about whether they want to do that or not, whether it is worth it to bring it to council to make another point, to get people on the record to say where, there's a lot of people, including the mayor, who've never voted on Tewin, right? Because they were not on council last time. So to get them on the record as to where they stand on this, but also is bringing this issue forward going to, what is that going to do to the relationship with Indigenous host nations in Ottawa to still kind of look to be like you're making a political play of this? So I think that some councillors are talking with each other, speaking with Indigenous groups about what to move forward. Mm-hmm. Whatever happens, even if it does move forward, I would be surprised if it fails, if it actually passes at council, but it would be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah. Well, okay. So John, you mentioned that this is one of the major themes here was around reconciliation, whether reconciliation has been done properly. There's also a second theme that is this just a good development or not, right? Like, does this make sense if these are good lands and to develop on? So let's talk about those two issues, but let's start with the second one first. So is this a good project? So to either of you, like, should we be going ahead with Tewin really on the merit of its of the project itself?
Under no circumstances, I would say. I am not equivocating here. Okay, I'm going to take us back a couple of years. I know everyone loves it when we go through the urban boundary official plan process that took 2 to 3 years. I'm actually not going to go through it all. But when the city was looking to add, they had decided, okay, we're going to add 1,280 hectares to the urban boundary. These are lands that we're going to put in so people can build homes. That was thought of as the middle option. The idea that, well, half of our growth is going to come from intensification, which, by the way, is very aggressive. And the other half is going to come from expanded parts of the city. Some people call that sprawl. Anyhow, the landowners, when they decide, they basically nominate their lands to say, yeah, we don't want to be in because that makes your land super, super valuable. And the city scores them, right? Scores them on criteria that the council agrees on. And they're looking for things like, is it easy to build on these lands? Is it close to services like water, wastewater, roads? Can we get transit there? Is it going to be near transit? You look to see, are these lands already attached to the urban boundaries? So the idea of adjacent lands, right? You're just adding on to like places that are already there. And by the way, these are principles that you have to follow in provincial policy called the, provincial policy statement. Actually, it's now called the provincial planning statement. Anyway, there are actual rules. Tewin does not meet any of these criteria, none. And in fact, when this motion was walked on, like it was not like Tewin came out of the blue during this process that was years long. It came in the last week of a 3-year process. Staff had not even scored it because they considered these lands so poor that they hadn't even looked at it. And even later, they're like, okay, if you want to add it, council, you can. You're the boss, but I guess we'll have to look at it. And I also would say during that process that the province, this is the public service part, the experts, the planning experts and engineering experts, they wrote the city warning them when they saw what was happening, that said, you must be following, don't forget you have to follow provincial policy that says, these lands, have to be adjacent to the urban boundary. They threw out land that scored super high. This is council, I should say. Council threw out land that scored super high to put in land that was not even considered. So I could go on. Obviously, I will stop now. But yes, the answer is no. Terrible planning decision.
John, do you agree, or do you have a different perspective?
No, well, I mean, because from a planning perspective, because it's proposing to create pretty much a town or a mini city far from existing municipal services, it's hard to understand how this makes sound planning sense. But I like being devil's advocate here on the pod. So what if
we need a devil?
What if? Well, I think that there's a problem with the land and whatnot, but what if Tewin really is an interesting experiment to build a new 15-minute community with all the things that we long for in a community, like protected bike infrastructure, walkable communities, attractive main streets. Like, I think it has a proposal to have zero waste, new businesses, employment opportunities, trees. Tewin through Taggart, Algonquins of Ontario, they're proposing to build a community on Indigenous values that, honesty, respect, humility, bravery, love, truth, like all these things built into the community from the ground up.
And so they started that by clear cutting trees in the middle of the night without telling
the blank slate first.
That's a really fabulous Indigenous principle there.
Yeah. So I from a planning perspective, yeah, it's hard to make sense. And to, like Joanne said, it was like put onto the table last minute in the name of reconciliation. But I wonder if we're going to move forward and this thing is really going to happen. I'm curious to see how this is going to become this community, this ideal community that it's plotted to be on paper. And we're going to talk about the reconciliation question here in a second. I've always wondered if there's room at the table for other Algonquin nations in the region other than AOO, the Algonquins of Ontario, if they could somehow come to the table for this development, because right now it's really murky and I don't know where this is going to land. Maybe in court, maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah.
And actually, to be fair to John, I just want to add that vision that he painted out, painted for us of this very sustainable town, 15-minute neighborhoods, that was the vision that was sold to councillors beforehand, right? The Tewin, especially being fronted by the AOO, they put out this ideal concept. And I think that was really attractive to some councillors. I'm not saying that they're all like corrupt or anything. That's not true. But how realistic is that? That's the other question.
Yeah, well, that's the key thing. And, John, I'm glad you brought up that idea that this could be, the sort of model small city of the future. But this was something that came up during the committee discussion. And so the Taggart Corporation had sent their land planning consultant to talk about this. And she said, for instance, she gave some statistics. She said, 90% of people are going to be within 10 minutes of transit and whatnot, or within a bike lane. But, interestingly, the debate later on came up. One councillor was asking, well, a lot of these new communities have been promised transit. It never appears. And so what happens, right? You have these, 90% of people are within a theoretical, walking distance. But if there's no transit, there's no transit. And the other thing that was the consultant did not talk about was, would these communities actually have the mixed use that we actually need for
we talk about employment lands all the time, but the jobs don't come.
That's right. So, if in a sense, if there's nothing to walk to, then, it's not much point in talking about a walkable community, right? But I actually delegated at the committee on Wednesday, and my main point was that this is a really significant discussion. And it's to what John was saying, is that we're talking about creating a new city here. And I don't think people realize the scope of what is in play here. This is not just sort of opening up a new subdivision sort of on the edge of town. This is saying we are going to create a new satellite city. We're going to create a fourth satellite city around around the Greenbelt in Ottawa. So, currently we have Orleans, we have Canada, Stittsville.
Which was also, Canada was supposed to be its own town and city. And how did that work out?
That's right. And then
lovely, but it is a suburb of Ottawa.
That's right. And then third one, of course, is Barrhaven. Now, what I found actually quite remarkable at the committee discussion, a few times people asked, so how many people are we talking about out here? And the city would not answer that question. They said, well, it's too early to say, we can't say. And I've done some research into this previously. And so in the reporting that came out afterwards, this will probably be like 35 to 45,000 people. I'm like scratching my head saying, that's not what I remember. And sure enough, that seems to be like a number that's floating around on the internet, including on, I think, some of the Tewin documents. But when I went back to the infrastructure master plan, it says that the Tewin proposed, like the current lands that are proposed with the 445 hectares, would house about 17,000 people. But then in the infrastructure master plan, you dig around, it says there are these surrounding lands, what they call the South Urban Community. They use the acronym the SUC.
That's very apropos. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Anyways, they're talking about, this SUC being another 92,000 people. So we're talking about, this could be a community of about 100,000 people in the southeast of Ottawa. So really the way to think about it is we are talking about putting a Barrhaven into the southeast of Ottawa. And I don't think people understand that, including Councillor Isabel Skowski, whose ward this is in. And of course, I believe that if you put it that way to people, both in the ward, but also across the city, people would say, well, I think we need to talk about that. Whether that makes sense.
And you'll say why you don't think that Councillor Skowski doesn't get that, because you said that you were surprised by some of her comments.
Well, you know what? There was a comment that Councillor Skowski made at the end. And let me just see if I just want to get the quote right here. She said, okay, and I quote, "People don't move to rural Ottawa to end up in the middle of an urban development." Now, which is, I would argue, that's exactly what Tewin is going to be.
Yeah.
And what I was surprised about was Councillor Skowski was not one of the people that voted to remove this from the urban boundary. She voted to continue with the status quo. And I even thought the line of questioning that Councillor Skowski was putting forward suggested that she was fairly open to this proposal. Now, I don't want to put words in her mouth, and she has been, I think she's being careful not to declare either way. But that was, that was just the impression that I got. But did you get a different impression?
No, that was the impression, but I just wanted to make sure that was, and I think it was actually a difficult issue because it did come up during the by-election. I think we're going to talk about that later a little bit on how everybody wrapped up, because there were some pretty heated moments at the end, which I loved. It was like very old school council.
Well, it got spicy. It got spicy.
Yeah. And
so I think that.
Yeah, and so I think you heard people say this in that by-election. They just want more information, right? It's really hard to get your head around what's going to happen. And in Tewin especially, she says, there are people who are on a trickle water system, and they feel like if Tewin comes, they're going to get actually better services. And yeah, so of course they're in favor of it, but people who'd be right next to it are not in favor. And so it's very controversial in her ward. But I do take your point that, do people just think it's going to be a village? Like, what do they think it's going to be, right? And so, walkable communities are going to be like a little cute Main Street. I don't know. I don't know, right? And so, go ahead, John.
Well, I was going to say, and who's going to be responsible for the public realm? So when a plan like this comes forward, the designs look really sexy, right? oh, this is what it's going to look like. It's always the drawings
Artist
are
rendering.
always done at dawn or at dusk.
So many a thing.
You know, they look really nice, and I always love going back to the original renderings and how buildings look now and see if it actually come to fruition. But there are so many questions about, especially I think, the public realm. So it's proposing all this great stuff in the public realm. So the public realm was owned by the public, right? The municipality.
And paid for, yes.
And pays for it. And that's exactly what I'm getting at. And it's like, so real, like that's the ideal. Hopefully we don't disappoint the whole city by building it up and not being able to deliver at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah. Can I make one last point about the merits of this proposal? And that is, you know, as the economist on the panel, I would be remiss not to mention this. You'll remember, and I mentioned this in my delegation on Wednesday, that you'll remember that the city commissioned this report by the Hempson Consulting to ask the question of what is the cost of growth of a new home. So, and they were able to say, look, we can calculate the cost of a new home inside the existing green belt, like inside the green belt, basically as infill, or we can estimate the cost of a new subdivision at the edge of town, similar to what we're talking about here. And you know, you'll remember this story got a lot of coverage. That they basically said if when we're talking about building new homes at the edge of town as greenfield developments, that typically costs on average about $465 per year per person. So in other words, all of us, all existing residents of Ottawa need to subsidize these new developments going forward in perpetuity. And that's recognizing two things. Number one is that the cost of servicing further away properties is more expensive. You know, you can imagine the snowplow, if it has to travel twice as far, it's going to spend twice as much on gas. But also, perhaps more importantly, is that we know that with the new project, development charges will be used to finance the initial construction of infrastructure. But that infrastructure needs to be maintained, it needs to be repaired, and eventually it needs to be replaced. And that is extremely expensive. And that's where, you know, if we have the option between building in an existing community, and you know, you can think of a place like, say, Tunney's Pasture, right? Or Bayview Yards, or Confederation Heights, you know, near the RA Center. These are all lands that are very close to existing infrastructure. They don't require a lot of new investment in water pipes and roads. That's a relatively low cost way to provide new housing. What we're doing with Tewin is a high cost way to provide new housing. And in fact, I even Joanne, I even brought this prop to committee.
Oh, money!
Yeah, this $100
finally.
For those of you that are listening, I'm holding up a brand new $100 bill. I got it out of the bank machine. And what, by my calculations, again, if we're talking about somewhere in the range of 100,000 residents in this new community, we are actually asking every single household in Ottawa to pay the equivalent of about $100 a year to subsidize this new development out at Tewin. And I think, well, this is a rhetorical question, but I think it's fair to say that if you were to ask councillors, would you go knock on doors of your residents and say, would you be willing to provide, one of these $100 bills every year to finance this new subdivision? They'd say, are you crazy? I
just want to push back a little bit on the Hempstead report, only to say, in general, of course, intensification is going to be cheaper than adding on. The comparison, though, is always to a high-rise, like a multi-residential unit, to a in the core, to a standalone home, right? And you're going to then say, okay, well, obviously everybody, it would be better if everybody lived in an intensification area in a multi-residential complex. And I love that idea, but I think we know not everybody wants to do that, right? And so the pushback has always been, well, do we ever compare apples and apples? It's apples and oranges because it's a different kind of housing model. So I think that's the widest gap you're ever going to see, right? Like what it costs to build, a multi-res unit in downtown versus a house in the suburbs. So I think that there are other ways to compare it, but I do take the point that generally speaking, yes, it's going to cost more. Also, I don't think they don't drive the snowplows from downtown out to Barrhaven. They have their own in Barrhaven, right? So there's a bit of that. I just want to be devil's advocate, but of course, to service it, to get transit out there, to keep up the roads. We know the roads are a mess everywhere. How are we going to do that when it's that far? So the whole thing is a mess. Yes.
Yeah. Well, listen, I will avoid the temptation to push back on the pushback in the interest of time. But instead, Joanne, I will give you the question of let's turn to that issue of reconciliation.
Oh my God, that's the payback I get for pushing back on the Hempstead report.
I will say it is a tricky question, and it's obviously very nuanced. So can we ask you to do your best to explain the way that you see this issue?
Okay. So Taggart has always wanted this land out in this Tewin community. In fact, I know that representative of Taggart went to ask Bob Shirelli when he was infrastructure minister to sell them that land. And Bob Shirelli said, no, there's a whole process. And, and so it was actually presented to the group, the Algonquins of Ontario, that bought the land, and they got the money from Taggart. The issue is Algonquins of Ontario is a complex organization. It is a group of one First Nation, one federally recognized First Nation, Pikwakanagan, and 10 other communities. There's many members of the Algonquins of Ontario who see themselves as Algonquins, but they don't have, for example, official status. And it is really dicey and complicated, and I'm not going to get into that. But it has been controversial, including recently 2,000 voters in the Algonquins of Ontario got thrown out of the organization. They can no longer vote because their ancestry was in question. This includes the woman who actually argued for this development at council back in 2021. So it's very tricky. The Algonquins of Ontario basically were formulated by the federal government to be a negotiating body for modern day treaties, because the Algonquins, Indigenous people, they do not recognize provincial borders, right? And so, the federal government's like, well, we want to negotiate with a province or a provincial body. And so the problem is other Algonquin nations, they do not recognize the Algonquins of Ontario as a legitimate negotiating body. And so the city, not the city, I would say councillors, the old, Mayor Jim Watson, Jan Harder, Tim Tierney, these folks all thought they're being very clever, and Taggart, I would say, to say that, this is going to be a controversial planning file, but look, we have the Algonquins of Ontario on side, and we're going to present this as reconciliation. Because who will argue against reconciliation? Well, it turns out quite a lot of people on a planning side, and perhaps most importantly, other Algonquin nations who say, what the hell? We don't consider this a reconciliation. And they started that. I remember Claudia Commanda, she was furious. She was so mad. They had just renamed the bridge, the pedestrian bridge out here where I live near Bayview Yards, the William Commanda Bridge after her grandfather. And she's like, this is meaningless. This reconciliation's not real. And so we heard from people this week at committee from Algonquin nations. I'm just going to read some of their names so I get them right. The Grand Chief Savannah McGregor of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation Tribal Council. They represent 7 federal First Nations. Grand Chief Lisa Robinson of the Algonquin Nation Secretariat, which represents Berry Lake. They had a lawyer who was actually from Pikwakanagan, who's a professor. These people came to speak about it, that they are furious and that they don't recognize this as a reconciliation. They want to be consulted on this. And, they pointed to the National Capital Commission on how they've been consulting on LeBreton and say there are other ways that are better than this. Now, we heard from Wendy Jocko. She is the chief of the Pikwakanagan First Nation. Again, they are the only federally recognized First Nation in Algonquins of Ontario. And they said, she said, she was horrified that council is debating who's a real Indigenous person, right? And who's a real Algonquin and who isn't. And I 100% agree with her. That is not the city's job. And I also would say, it's not up to me or council to tell the Algonquins of Ontario what is reconciliation. I'm just going to turn off my dinging phone. There we go. But So, yeah, but it is the city's job to make decisions on planning. It's the city's job to be informed on what reconciliation means. They just made up this reconciliation stuff on the fly. I wrote that in 2021 because I do believe, and I've been told this on background from people, that they thought this would be not the Algonquins of Ontario, but actually other councillors like, well, this is great. Look, we can get this plan through by calling it reconciliation. And what they've done is just really screw up the relationship of the city with many First Nations people. So I don't know if that is clear, but yeah, it's, you can't just wrap a bad planning decision in reconciliation. That's not true partnership. And they should be honest with what they're doing. And also they just, as I said, I think they didn't think it ahead. Obviously, reconciliation, Indigenous issues, land issues, ancestry issues, they're so complicated, right? You think you're going to understand them, you're not going to understand them, right? And so I think the city started us down a really, really unfortunate path.
Yeah.
So that was long. I don't know if that was clear enough, but it's very good. And I'm not an expert at all, so I'm always a little bit.
No, that was good. And thanks for taking that on, Joanne, because it's not easy. And to that point, John, during the council debate, we saw these two views that seemed to be diametrically opposed, right? On the one hand, you had the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation Tribal Council representatives saying that the city is clearly offside here on a legal perspective, that this is, and some of the media reporting around this was that this is very there's very basic misinterpretations of the law here and of the Constitution. On the other hand, you had the city coming in and saying, no, we've done everything we need to do. We are, we're on solid legal standing here. And it's like, at some point, one of these parties is right and one of these parties is wrong. And I have to admit, we're not lawyers, but am I misinterpreting something here, John, or is these two ships that are going to crash in the middle of the night?
More like in the middle of a courtroom, Neil. It couldn't come to that. But I mean, the question comes down to, did the city of Ottawa properly consult the relevant Indigenous communities before making a decision on Tewin? Was there meaningful, the term that usually uses meaningful consultation, and with the right parties too? So it could come down to a tribunal. If this is going to be a land tribunal case, or if it's going to go elevate to the court, it's going to be up to them to answer the question of whether the city essentially consulting the AAO meets the test. And I wonder, in some ways, I wonder if the deputations that have been made by representatives of the Algonquin communities that Joanne talked about at committee at City Hall constitute some consultation. Consultation doesn't exactly mean that council agrees with what people say and goes and makes a decision based on that. It's fairly hearing out parties, right? But I gotta say, this underscores the importance of the city of Ottawa having a plan going forward for cases like this. So it has a reconciliation action plan. I think it's about 7 years old now. But I don't know if it goes into if there's a planning matter, a land use matter, you got to make sure you talk with these specific groups before you come to a decision at council. So that
I mean, the Algonquins of Ontario do own that land with the Taggart, right? They're the actual property owners, I believe. Well, they own some of it. Most of it, actually, that's developable is owned by Taggart. That's the other issue that it is that they decided that they would call it reconciliation. If they just went, oh, the Algonquins of Ontario have partnered with Taggart. Taggart bought a bunch of land and wants to build it there, and this is just a planning decision. I don't know that we would be hearing this pushback. I think it's because they said it's part of reconciliation.
It's interesting,
right? By naming it that, then you got to actually say, okay, what is did you meet your duty to consult, including under, by the way, the provincial planning statement actually compels people to consult. So what does that look like?
Well, it's interesting. The provincial planning statement does talk about consultation, but it was interesting to hear city lawyers say, actually, to their reading, the Constitution doesn't compel municipalities to consult, have a duty to consult. It actually, according to the city lawyers, it's a feds and provincial responsibility to consult under the Constitution, right? So the Constitution doesn't talk about municipalities. Municipalities are creatures of the province. So maybe there's a lawsuit against the province here and not the city. I don't know.
That's never
but
bad.
I thought that was really interesting observation, insight from city lawyers.
Yeah. Now it's important to highlight. I think we mentioned this very briefly, but that the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation Tribal Council and others have said that they are prepared
Mhm.
to take the city to court on this. Now, they haven't said they will, but they said they're prepared to. And interestingly, they're not the only ones that have said they'll take the city to court on this. So, um, Joanne, did you catch the line from
No, no. Will you tell?
the Taggart consultant
Oh,
have sort of closed her remarks by saying, and if this motion goes forward, i.e., the lands are taken out of the urban boundary, my client will, and I'm paraphrasing here, my client will exercise their rights to take
oh
this to
yeah.
the Ontario Land Tribunal.
Of
So
course. That is not a surprise, not remotely a
no,
surprise. Yeah.
no, okay. So we referred to this at the outset that this meeting got rather testy towards the end. I mean, it was a 5-hour meeting, but tempers started to flare at the end. So who wants to bring us up to speed on what happened there? John, Joanne, who
Well,
wants to start us off?
I could talk
Yeah.
about, first of all, Councillor Isabel Skalski and kind of her comments that I found they're really interesting. You could tell she's upset, and then she wasn't fiery necessarily, but she was stern. She was upset that this motion was coming, and as she pointed out, it was during her by-election, right, in her ward, and so she didn't seem very happy. She, dismissed this as being politically motivated, and she didn't like how a motion just popped up during the by-election and forced everyone just to start arguing over this again. And I remember her saying she lamented the politics. But I don't know if and you guys mentioned this earlier, she's got a tough ward here because some people kind of like this for the services it brings, right? Possibly. And business and the infrastructure, of course. A lot of people are afraid of bringing the urban area way out into their rural community. I don't know if so I don't know. I'd be curious to see if this does come to council, hear from her again to see where she would cast a vote. But I found that really interesting. Just her real distaste about this being a political play that has landed essentially in her lap.
It's amazing when people go into government and then they're surprised that there's politics involved. I don't there's bad politics and good politics. Is this political? Yeah, that's how it got approved in the first place. 100% purely political decision. And so this idea that if you made a bad decision, we should never oh, well, that's too bad we made that decision. Time to move on. Let's not revisit it ever again. It's crazy, that idea, right?
Yeah.
And I get that she's in a hard position, but that is a huge thing that we heard yesterday about well, we've spent money and time on this. And I heard actually the mayor was quoted earlier this week in a story saying that people don't want to talk about this again. I don't know. I disagree. I know a lot of people who are very mad about this. And so there's a whole Neil has inspired me with his economist talk, but this whole sunk cost fallacy, the idea that, well, we put time and effort and money and stuff into things, so we can't turn back now. This leads us to very, very bad decisions. Lansdowne 1.0 possibly is going to land us into Lansdowne 2.0, and this. So people are arguing it in kind of a lot of weird ways, but I don't know. The idea always that if something is hard, it's political. I find that, that's where we are, folks. We're in government. There's politics here.
The only thing that's going to stop this now, guys, I think, is either a collapse between the relationship between Taggart and AOO or a court weighing in at this point, because I think this council isn't going to reverse course. And I don't know if a 2026 council would do it either, if it comes back to the table next year. So I think at this point, it's going to be out of City Hall's hands what happens next.
Well, John, I think that's a fair assessment, and I suspect that this thing is headed for the courts, and you could see this getting wrapped up in the courts for a very long time. But the other aspect to this that I think is important to remember is that in order to create Tewin, we need to bring water pipes across the Greenbelt, and the Greenbelt belongs to the NCC. NCC, of course, is a federal organization. And so, I don't know to what degree that complicates it, right? And does the NCC weigh in at some point and say, we can or cannot go ahead because of some of these reconciliation issues? So it is a very complicated file. And I suspect I'd be surprised if we see it going to council next week. But I don't think anyone's got the appetite to bring it up again. But I'm glad. I'm really glad that Teresa Kavanagh brought this motion forward. I think there was never, as you mentioned, Joanne, there's really very little public input at the start of the process. This just went in, and then sort of takes on a life of its own, and a lot of people say, "Oh, it's gone too far. We can't possibly turn back."
Well,
At this
this is
point.
tyranny. Like Tim Tierney, he I took issue with a number of things he said. First of all, why are we talking about this again? Let's not revisit it. Like, I don't find that a really compelling argument. And he points out that some of the delegations who came to speak against it, well, they don't want any urban boundary expansion. No, it's not like they want to swap out Tewin, which is 455 hectares, a lot, for other lands. What they want is nothing. And in fact, he says he regrets that council didn't add more land the first time around, right? Because we need more housing. And he says that, if Tewin's removed, like, where are they going to find this land in other communities that already people are pushing back against infrastructure, or, against intensification, like, in his own neighborhoods. Then he said also, not everyone wants to live in a 1,000 square foot box, right? Some people want, I guess, bigger suburban homes. And I am sitting in my 1,000 square foot box right here, my little bungalow with no front door out near Tiny's pasture. And I'm like, 1,000 square feet, I have 3-bedroom home here. I don't have a huge home here. If we had 1,000 square foot box or 1,000 square foot apartments, holy smokes, or even just 1,000 square foot homes, right? We could fit more homes into the areas we had. We would go a long way to fixing our housing crisis problem. So I'm very annoyed by that. But also, he's just sort of the idea that he talked about as if Tewin was going to help the housing crisis. Like, it's not coming anytime soon. Like, we're lucky if there's a shovel in the ground in 10 years. That it's like, and you brought up the, NCC bringing the pipes across the green, but it is ridiculous that Tewin is going to be a way to, bring on housing supply anytime in the near future. Also, he was the one who brought the Tewin motion originally to council in 2021, out of the blue, out of nowhere. He wanted to argue that this is a planning decision, but in fact, actually, his motion mentions reconciliation. He got into a crazy argument with CBC's Kate Porter, who, by the way, does a great debrief. I mean, you should listen to our podcast, but you should also listen to Kate. She does a great debrief on Ottawa Morning about this. But she says, you're the one who mentioned reconciliation in your motion. And he said, not in the therefore. So if you've ever seen a motion, there's a million, where is this? Where is that? Where is that? Therefore, let's do this. Well, one of the whereases talks about reconciliation, right? It's obviously the spirit of why they're adding this land is reconciliation. And so for him now to say it's not about reconciliation is completely ridiculous. And he seems to just be we should add more land. Let's add more land everywhere, no matter where. So that's kind of he was very outspoken yesterday, and I think incorrect in some ways.
And I'm glad that he got called to account, both by your former colleague Kate Porter, but also by certainly Councillor Menard in during the meeting itself.
It was such old school Menard came back. I was so happy. He was so mad. And also, I have to say, Sean Menard has been much more level-headed over the last year, which I think is good. But it also, when he does get upset, I think it's much more effective, right? And yesterday, he's just, I had some great quotes of his. It was very much, that people are talking about both sides of their mouths. Oh, we have to keep taxes low, but then we're going to put money into Lansdowne. We want the city to be efficiently run, but then we make decisions that are not going to make it efficient, building a new town in the middle of nowhere. It says, and now here we are again, this council making another ridiculous decision to not go back and look at what you did wrong, which was wrong. And, I'm tired of it. I'm tired of sitting around this table and having decisions made over and over again. And I was like, yeah. I thought that really captured the frustration of what was happening.
Yeah. And you know what? I was really pleased to see Tierney being called out for that original walk-on motion back in 2021, because it really frustrates me to see the council that on the one hand says, we need to work better and more collaboratively than the last council did. On the other hand, we're seeing increasingly more and more of these walk-on motions where it's it's an 11th hour motion that doesn't allow for any public debate, doesn't allow for any real discussion about it. We saw this with like one of the files that I was involved with was around, should Lansdowne have a referendum? And this was brought to committee this was introduced as a notice of motion to committee that something should be discussed the next week. Kathy Curry came on with a walk-on motion to basically say, no, we're going to talk about it right now so that the public delegations wouldn't have that opportunity. Like this sort of behavior, I find it really discouraging. I wish councillors would allow for more public engagement. I think, there's residents that want to be a part of building a better city, and we're just taking away those opportunities. So yeah, John?
I think just quickly that Tewin motion should go down the walk-in motion Hall of Fame. I think that, like, in terms of walk-on motions at council, look at how much we're talking about this one planning policy, one planning project, in terms of the impact and the domino effect. That's got to be, like, there's got to be a Hall of Fame for walk-on motions, and that should be the first entry.
Yes, John, we are going to do that. We are going to have the walk-on motion Hall of Fame, and Councillor Tierney, you have the inaugural position on that.
He gets the star for that. Yes.
Okay. Listen, let's move on briefly to the issue of Lansdowne. Now, this is coming back to committee and council over the next couple of weeks. There's going to be a lot of action. I don't want to talk about the analytics of it today because we'll have lots of time to do that. But can we just talk about the process, John? So what should people expect coming forward over the next few weeks?
Yeah, this Tewin discussion, guys, leads into another fiery discussion, right, in a couple weeks. So Lansdowne, as you say, Neil, is coming up. We should get a staff report on the 20th, on Monday. And so people can dig into that before it goes to the Finance Committee on the 29th and 30th of October. So they're looking at 2 days of committee meetings. I suspect they're expecting a lot of people signing up. Maybe someone on this panel will be there, signed up too, to talk about it. I don't know.
Perhaps we know one of those delegates.
I was going to say, Neil, this must be like your Super Bowl here. The Lansdowne. And then the audit committee is going to dig into the Lansdowne issue too on the 4th of November before it goes to council on the 7th. So we have 2 weeks ahead of Lansdowne mania, Lansdowne 2.0 mania. And so we've been waiting for this for a while, guys. Now we're coming off Tewin. We're going to go into Lansdowne, and then we're going to get into the city budget. So as every fall is at City Hall, it's always can be dramatic, fiery, super interesting if you're nerds like us that want to pay attention to municipal politics.
Yeah. So Joanne, I want to ask you, John mentioned that the reports are just about to come out and that the committee meetings, essentially a week and a bit later. That's about, 7 to 10 days before the committee meeting. Councillor Wilson Lowe, this is going back 2 years, he had a motion that said when staff release this, they should make every effort to give 30 days notice so that, this is important. This is heavy stuff to get through. It's important issues. There's a lot of money involved. And so people, both the public, but of course, councillors themselves deserve the time to be able to go through this rigorously. Doesn't look like that's going to happen. What sort of, do you see any sort of pushback to that?
I don't see, I find that is a terrible decision. We talk about trust in government and transparency and accountability. This is just meeting the procedural bylaw requirements that it is for other than planning. Reports are supposed to come out 7 business days before the meeting. So on the 20th is just 7 days. And when on the 20th will they come out? Will they come out in the morning? Are they going to come out at 7 p.m.? We've had that, John. Remember waiting around all day, looking, refresh, are the reports out? Are the reports out yet? And so obviously it did not, that motion of Wilson Lowe did not compel the city, the staff to get it out 30 days in advance, but everybody agreed to it. It is too much. Remember when LRT2 came out and people had 14 days to get through, literally a $4.7 billion plan? That's not enough time. You want people to make good decisions. You want people to have trust in their local government. That takes some effort. And no, I'm completely against that. I get that the report is complicated and I think it was delayed, but then just move your meeting. Just move the meeting. Yeah. And I know there's a budget, there's other stuff, but I don't know, that's your problem, city. Why did you plan it like this? That, all of these things were coming at one time. So I think it's really unfortunate because it's going to be very complicated. And the fact that the audit is coming right after that, and the auditor doesn't actually have the information yet either, right, on Lansdowne 2.0. yeah, it's really bad, I think, for accountability and transparency. It looks poorly, I think, on the city to
Okay.
have it through this
Listen,
quickly.
we've had an extended discussion here. Why don't we end it there? That's it's good to get into Tewin in detail, because quite frankly, when I look at the two big issues that are facing the city right now in terms of discretionary spending, one is around Lansdowne, the other is around Tewin, and these are big choices that council needs to be making, and so I'm glad that we've been able to go into both of those in considerable detail, and I guess we'll be going back into one of them in more detail. So that is it for this week. I want to thank both Joanne and John for all their thoughts today.
Can I make a plug for something?
Please
On
go ahead.
Lansdowne? On Lansdowne?
Okay.
On November 3rd, I believe,
Yes.
there will be a Lansdowne forum somewhere in Barrhaven, I believe.
That's
I
right.
was recently asked to moderate it because I have some institutional knowledge on Lansdowne. And the idea is, by then the reports will be out, the committee meeting will have been held. Come out to ask questions, make comments, talk to some people. They're hoping to have a staff person there. Don't know if that's going to happen or where it's going to be. I'll be there to make sure everyone's behaving themselves. It's going to be a very respectful conversation, push back on various ideas. But I think, as to your point, Neil, it's going to be, it is a very, very big file. It's the most money I think that we're going to be spending in this term of council. And so keep an eye out for that. We'll let you know where it is, but it would be good to have a bigger community discussion if possible.
Yes, and more information on that meeting will be coming out early next week, and we'll certainly be talking more about that. So thanks for bringing that up, Joanne. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please send them our way. We'd love to hear from you. And I just one last thing. So we're looking at the calendar for next week at City Hall. It doesn't look very busy. However, so I was saying to John and Joanne, could we take a week off here, maybe? But however, what I notice is that every time I say that, something new comes up on the agenda, and I suspect that there will be a pretty full set of issues to talk about.
The Lansdowne actual reports are coming out, so we might want to take a quick read of those.
Yeah. So we'll see. I suspect we'll be back next week. If not, we'll definitely be back in 2 weeks. So we look forward to talking again, and we will see you then. Thank you very much.